Ancient Testimony, Psalm 139, 1 through 12. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind, and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you.
So Julian of Norwich, why would we turn to this saint from 650 years ago to address the modern day pandemic? Well, as I noted in that children's moment, Julian did live during a pandemic, and that pandemic actually circulated, came back 4 times during her lifetime. So literally her entire life was framed by the pandemic. Can you imagine just how much we're just aching for this to be over, right? And imagine now this going on for the rest of your days, coming back and returning it again. Well, that may be ahead of us too. We don't know. Hopefully not. But there's one point in her life where she seems to have contracted the disease, or contracted something at least extremely serious, to the point where she was literally on her deathbed. And on May 8th, that should be 1373, pretend that 8 is a 3, 1373, literally the priest was pronouncing last rites over Julian. And if you've ever been in that situation where like you thought you were going to die, maybe you've had an experience where when you absolutely are completely convinced you're going to die in a few moments, certain things happen. Some people actually die, but other people experience things like their life flashing in front of them, just all at once. I think I've already told you that story when that happened to me. I thought I was going to die. Well, what she actually experienced was a vision and a conversation with Jesus in her own kind of inner state. And she wrote about that in a book called Revelations of Divine Love. She's actually the very first woman on earth her book was the very first book written by a woman in English. So it's a very profound book, and we're going to get into that. We'll be looking at that little excerpts from her writings during the series. But at one point, then she was attending this cathedral. This is in Norwich, England, and she here. I'm going to a second here. She entered a cell in the church. At the time, it was one of the practices of some people. They're called anchorites. They would literally go into a small room, and they would literally stay there for the rest of their lives. And the bishop would pronounce over them last rites as if they were dying. And but in Julian's case, her cell had an opening into the church, a little window, so she could worship with people, but it also had a window to the outside, which is on a major market street, and sailors used to port there and come up, and so she would talk to people there too. So she had an active ministry, even though she lived in this cell. She would write there, and then she would also counsel people and pray and so forth. And when you look at her writings, it's amazing how, given how just what a dark period this was. I mean, just imagine again, the coronavirus thing on steroids, um, how lively her writings are and how joy-filled they are, even as she counsels not to just look at the bright side of life at all. But she wrote about themes that are surprisingly fresh and relevant for our day. Here are a few of those that really come out of her writings. The fact that that we need to, even in the midst of our darkness, acknowledge those places of joy, that sometimes the darkness acts like a night sky where the light things that are normally there, you just don't notice, come into more direct notice. And it's important during those dark times to look at those stars, because those bright parts of our lives can act like stars to guide us through the dark times. She also wrote about God and nature being one. And each one of these subjects, we're going to have a worship reflection on in coming weeks. But in a time when people thought nature was horrible because of the pandemic, she saw nature, just like the Celtic Christians did, as an incarnation of God's love and goodness, and therefore nature and God were in full alignment with each other. And so we always need to look at the good of behind what nature is doing. She also wrote very deeply about God in feminine terms, and would call Christ her mother and so forth. Very much ahead of her times, but not as much as you'd think. There were other mystics who spoke of the feminine qualities of God as well. And then also, again, this is the 14th century, she spoke about non-dualism. That is you going out of that polarity between one thing and another, seeing beyond the polarities into a greater oneness. Very much ahead of her time. And also in a day where people were rejecting the body, you had groups of monks that were literally called flagellants. They would go around deliberately hurting their bodies and abusing their bodies as an act of penance. She was talking about embracing our bodies and embracing the sensuality even in our bodies. And then also speaks very eloquently about the power of love over evil. And again, in her day, that was just kind of not so evident. But finally, another theme, and the one that we're on this morning, is she spoke about facing the darkness. Don't just look away. Don't just simply say, hey, it's all good. Don't act in denial. But actually, when we face the darkness can become our friend. Can give us insight that was not apparent to us before, as long as we're not running from the darkness, but facing it head on. Well, this last week, I posted up an invitation to all of you to reflect on how this pandemic has caused you to face your inner darkness yourself, or the darkness in society as well, in ways that help you learn things that you would like to take, give you insights that you'd like to take beyond the pandemic. And I was really delighted. I mean, not everybody would necessarily feel comfortable responding to that, but 7 of you actually did. And so I'm going to give turn over the rest of this part of the reflection, to you.
Hi, my name is Nell Egan, and I'm recording from the lovely Eugene, Oregon. I think this past year has brought out a lot of darkness in society, and I think that what I've learned from it is the importance of standing up for what you believe in and fighting for what is right and just and fair. And I hope to bring that through my life, not just in this year, but continuing on. And one thing that reminds me of that every day is this bobblehead of RBG that I keep on my desk. So I hope to continue fighting for what is right and what is just. Thanks.
The COVID-19 pandemic has opened my eyes and the eyes of many others, I believe, to the fact that we're actually in 2 pandemics, one being COVID and the other one being one of anti-Blackness or anti-color. And that has It's really important that COVID-19 has shown us this other one that has been underlying society for decades. And we really do need to look at it with a critical eye and address it in our new normal every day after the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
The darkness has sometimes felt overwhelming, especially during the fires in the summer of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. Another bleak reality is the sight of cops beating up protesters, armed insurrectionists showing up at rallies, even the US Capitol, to wreak havoc, to declare that hate rules. I feel that the only things I can change are my own relationships and commitments to the people I see in my corner of the world. I can be more thoughtful, compassionate, slower to judge the people I interact with. I can keep my heightened awareness of the ways in which I am privileged in my daily life, even in my comfortable isolation. These things I hope to take forward into the future after the pandemic subsides. There will be other pandemics, wildfires, violent protests, political crises. I need to stay in right relationship with God and other people.
Hello, I'm Rick Benetti, and I live in Medford, Oregon. The pandemic has revealed to me how interrelated we all are in the web of life and the fragile balance of life on Earth. As Matthew Fox puts it, the coronavirus emergency comes wrapped up inside the climate change emergency, for it's all part and parcel of the encroaching of the human population into the habitat of animals. Julian of Norwich inspires us to face our own extinction that is coming with the climate change bearing down on us. This is a time for us to reimagine a new future, a renewed humanity, and a more just and sustainable culture.
Hi, I'm Paris Hancock Egan, and my husband Kevin and I were talking about this, and we decided that the darkness we had to face was that we were so frustrated and angry at other people in the nation who seemed so willfully ignorant and selfish to not want to wear masks and to cause a ruckus about it and to even protest about it as if that's an important freedom to not wear a mask. And we found it so hard to actually be compassionate about that. And we had to try really hard to do it. And I'm ashamed about that, but that's true. We really had to work on that.
My name is Ian Lynch, and I live in Mentor, Ohio. I like to think of darkness as a gift. It's a tool. It's the dimming of that bright light of day that allows us to see the stars at night. But I do think that the bright light of day has, in the past, kept a number of folks from behaving in ways that are, well, ugly. And I think we saw that this year with the light removed. But I still hope that sitting in darkness is a way for us to reflect on our true selves and to find truth, because reconciliation, which is absolutely vital, requires truth.
For me, the pandemic, together with its related crises of this past year, namely racial justice, economic justice, climate justice, and immigrant justice, to name just a few, convinced me that our government institutions, city, state, national, and international, are absolutely unable to devise and implement the solutions we're going to need to fix a seriously polarized nation and world. So I think churches like ours here in Portland need to double down with other interfaith institutions to rebuild a moral foundation that will enable us to see each other in new and more productive ways as we devise together grassroots solutions to the problems we face. I think with God's help, we can do that.
Darkness in the age of COVID. Well, yeah, there's plenty of that going around. I've certainly wrestled with a lot of that over the last 4 or 5 months, and found that, or been reminded that a lot of the times where I'm fighting the darkness in the world. It comes from a place of where I've pushed away the darkness within myself. And so I go about as the good, trying to fight against the evil. I've reconnected just recently, and it's brought a spark back to my life with some communities I really love and people I love who are very intimately connected and vulnerable in their own darknesses and in their own demons. That kind of community is life-giving, and I'm so excited to come back to those communities after COVID and now. And I hope that maybe even a church community could become that.
Those reflections are quite profound, and they remind me of a poem by Mary Oliver that said, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift." Grant and Joe Pettit are going to offer a piece of music that was actually where the words are written by Julian of Norwich. And as music plays, I invite you to consider for yourself what darkness has presented itself to you in ways that could also be turned into a gift if the learnings were taken with us beyond the pandemic. Also want to just note that we will be offering communion at the end of worship today. So if you would like to gather elements for communion, I invite you to do that as well.
Said that all would be well, all manner of things would be well. All will be well, and all will be well. All manner of things will be well. With all the sadness wrought in this world, the good shall always prevail. All will be well, and all will be well. All manner of things will be well. In all the doubts that shroud simple truths, we pray for the wisdom of God. All will be well, and all will be well. All manner of things will be is firm and stands on the word that endures for all time. All will be well, and all will be well. All manner of things will be well. And so we pray to trust in the hope that all manner of things shall be well. All will be well, and all will be well. All manner of things will be well. Will be well. Will be well.
Modern testimony. Julian of Norwich on facing the darkness. If there is anywhere on earth a lover of God who is always kept safe, I know nothing of it, for it was not shown to me, but this was shown, that in falling and rising again, we are always kept in the same precious love. We need to fall, and we need to be aware of it, for if we did not fall, we should not know how weak we are of ourselves, nor should we know our Maker's marvelous love so fully. Deeds are done which appear so evil to us, and people suffer such terrible evils that it does not seem as though any good would ever come of them. And we consider this, sorrowing and grieving over it, so that we cannot find peace in the blessed contemplation of God, as we should do. And this is why our reasoning powers are so blind now, so humble and so simple, that we cannot know the high, marvelous wisdom, the might and the goodness of the holy. And this is what Jesus means when he says, you shall see for yourself that all manner of things shall be well, as if he said, pay attention to this now, faithfully and confidently, and at the end of time, you will truly see it in the fullness of joy.
So we are beginning our Lent series a couple weeks early. Lent doesn't actually begin until the 17th of February, but we are doing this extended look at this our pandemic reality and the post-pandemic one, where we would like to emerge as in the new normal once that it subsides. And we're reminded that Lent actually is that 40-day period minus Sundays, in which we remember that Jesus himself faced darkness. That was from the wilderness period that Luke reports on in Matthew as well, 40 days spent in the Judean wilderness. And we think about wilderness like with pine trees and forests and so forth, but this is the Judean wilderness you're seeing right here. This is more like where Jesus would have been fasting and praying, and probably feeling pretty pretty hungry, of course, but also according to Luke, that's where Satan, which in Hebrew, the word Satan means the adversary. That's where the adversary decided to meet him. And of course, we can find that adversary. We don't need inside ourselves. We don't need to look for some sort of figure with wings or devil with pitchforks or what have you. inside ourselves, there's always an adversary that exists within. And I just want to just kind of do a little Satanism for dummies for a moment here, as long as we're going to mention that side of things. And I didn't really actually write that book, but I just thought it was kind of a funny image. But we think about how would Jesus be tempted? Like, what would that adversarial voice within him be tempting him to do? We think about, when we think about evil, we think about evil tempting us to do overtly evil things. And yet, few of us are actually tempted by doing overtly evil things. I mean, once in a while, we might entertain the notion of throwing our boss out the window or what have you. But in general, we don't tend to be tempted by things that are overtly evil very much. And so you think about Jesus. I mean, here is the spiritual master. Is he going to be tempted by those things? Probably not. The way that the adversary appeared to Jesus would not likely have been through some temptations to do overtly evil things. I love William Blake's insight about Satan in the wilderness with Jesus. Like, he actually depicted an image of him back in the 19th century, I think. This is a picture of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the adversary. And one thing that I note right off, well, besides, of course, there seems to be a racial component here. Obviously, it's hard to tell which one is Jesus, really, but of course, what he's depicting is the adversary with darker skin. But and that's unfortunate. But what he's really actually getting at here is he wasn't trying to depict the adversary as evil, but rather the adversary looks like any good Old Testament prophet, and the adversary is actually pointing up to heaven, not down, to hell or something like this. And that's where I think Blake's insight is just really phenomenal, that if you're going to take a spiritual master like Jesus, he's not going to be tempted by overtly evil things. He's going to be tempted by only good things, but only things that are not the good for Jesus to be doing. Let me repeat that. He's going to be tempted. You're not going to tempt a spiritual master by overtly evil things. You're going to trying to get them off their path, off the path that they're called into, by getting them to do good things that aren't theirs to do or do primarily. And so you think about that wilderness experience. Jesus was tempted by three good things. One was turning bread into stone into bread, which was really a temptation to be able to feed the hungry, feed the world. And imagine if Jesus was focused only on feeding the world. Well, that's a good thing. And of course, Jesus did feed the hungry, but that was not the main thing that he was called to be doing. But that was the temptation, was to focus his entire efforts on feeding the hungry, which is a good thing and something that would garner sympathy for any person with a heartbeat and half a beat of compassion within them. Another temptation was to grab political power. And of course, Jesus did exercise political power, but he was not focused on that throughout. That was not his main focus. Whereas, imagine if Jesus was president instead of Donald Trump the last 4 years or what have you, or even now. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing to put laws in place that were reflective of Jesus's values rather than other ones? But again, that wasn't his primary path. But if he would have devoted himself to only politics, we wouldn't be hearing about him today. And finally, he was tempted to throw himself off of the temple and be saved by the angels. In other words, focus your whole ministry on miracles too. I mean, wouldn't it be great? I mean, convince everybody that he's the Christ, he's the one, right? And again, Jesus did miracles, but that was not the focus of his ministry. He was called to something else, something higher than any one of those those things could do. So each one of them represented a good and right thing to do, and a good and right thing that Jesus himself did at times. But each one of them, if they would have solely focused on them, that would have been a box for him that was too small to live within. So you think about yourself, what does this passage teach you and I? I mean, to me, it's very instructive about what normally tempts me. I'm not normally tempted by overtly evil things either. I doubt you are as well. Once in a while, but these are the really 4 ways that I find temptation regularly entering my path to do the wrong good. Oftentimes it's somebody else's good to do, not mine. And of course, in this pandemic, I mean, just remember all those responses we just received from 7 people in our congregation about how the pandemic has helped us see some really deep systemic issues in our society and things that we could devote the rest of our lives to doing. And some people totally are called to do that very thing. And so, but the key is to find the thing that is calling to you, not just simply that you're calling to it. The thing that brings you most fully alive in this world by doing it. Those are the kinds of actions that get sustainable energy behind them. And also, if we just get involved in trying to help others, but we're really not particularly personally animated by that, oftentimes we help people badly, or we could become patronizing. And so the key is to find, again, those things where you feel that the Holy Spirit is calling you into, and focus in that direction. Sometimes also I'm tempted to do the right good, but it's just the wrong timing. So I want to get at it right now, but this isn't the right time to do it. So I have to, again, pay attention to those still waters of the soul, and pay attention not simply to, am I doing the right good thing for me, but also is it the right timing? And I tend to be very impatient when I get a sense of call, but I have to continually remind myself to back off and ask, is this the right time, the right place? I also get very tempted by trying to do the good things that are way too big for me to accomplish, even working with others. I have a history of trying to change the whole world, and being discontented if I'm not doing that. It's been a hard learning over and over for me to make sure that the good I'm seeking to do is small enough, but grand, and maybe not even achievable in my lifetime, but my expectations of what will be accomplished are less than that grandeur. So I don't get discouraged. But finally, also making sure that the temptation, the good, isn't also too small. And this is where I, and I'm sure others who are here this morning, wrestle oftentimes with feeling of inadequacy, feelings like you're a failure, feelings of shame, feeling like you're no good, or you're not good enough. And so the Spirit also calls us to remind ourselves that God does not make junk, and that oftentimes we gravitate to goods that can be too small. We don't give ourselves enough credit for not only our own abilities, but also the fact that God, if God is calling, the Spirit is calling us, the Spirit intends to be with us and help us. And so we can take on something that's larger than ourselves, literally because there is a power larger than ourselves that is alongside us and within us and around us to help us. Well, in that respect, that last respect, I mean, those primary temptations of Jesus for him were goods that were too small for him to accomplish. There were things that he exercised, but also there was more to him than simply being a politician, or being a miracle worker, or even being someone who fed the hungry. And we are reminded actually in the meal that we know as communion of something of that larger purpose for his life. It's not that his life he only came to die in this world, as some Christians seem to believe, that he was just meant to die and somehow cleanse us of our sins and be done with it. I don't subscribe to that understanding at all. But what I do think is that in my understanding of Jesus is that he reveals something extremely important to the world about God and our relationship with the Spirit. That Jesus is he did not open the doorway of salvation. He did not make it possible for us to be put in right relationship with God. He actually revealed a doorway that had been open since the very, very beginning. And part of that doorway was signaled by the fact that when he was taken, he did not resist. He did not call on choirs of angels or the host of heaven to the heavenly armies to come down and defend himself, but rather was nonviolent to the very end. If that tells us something about God, it reminds us that in any situation where we are tempted to use violence, we would first ask, well, who would Jesus do this to? Who would Jesus bomb? Is a popular question that we need to ask ourselves whenever there's any violence that we're tempted with. And we are reminded if Jesus reveals something of the heart of God, and there's something about a parental relationship there. Again, we can go on, with all kinds of theological discourse about what does it mean to be son of God? But if you just simply take that metaphor, then the fact that he died and died brutally is a signal that if he reveals the heart of God, there is in God's heart of hearts knowledge of pain that is so deep it is akin to a parent losing an only child, and losing an only child brutally, that when we experience pain on very, very deep levels, if Jesus reveals the heart of God, we know that God is there in the heart of our pain, not simply absent there, that God is especially present in our darkness. The darkness is truly as light as day for God, in fact, because the cross also reminds us, and this meal reminds us that the death was not the end, but rather that God is somehow able to take the deepest pain that we can possibly experience and transform them into something that is like an empty tomb, transform our pains into the greatest joys as well. So I invite you to take your own elements, and let us remind ourselves that on a night of betrayal and desertion, Jesus took bread and he broke this bread, saying, "My friends, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me." So likewise, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me." By eating this bread and drinking this cup, we remember Christ's death, we celebrate Christ's resurrection, and we come to know that even in our own darkness, should it take us to the very place that Jesus went to, that in the end, he was right, Julian of Norwich was right. In the end, all will be well. All will be well. All will be very, very well, as love wins in the end. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Let us celebrate the feast.